Most important, we believe that in meeting our partners where they are and helping them to achieve their aspirations and goals for sustainable growth and development, we can be successful as we consider our own national security goals and those of our partners. Take as perhaps one of our foremost examples, the story of the Republic of Korea. In the aftermath of the Korean War and well into the 1960s, food and income were scarce in South Korea, with that country's economy on par with some of the most economically impoverished countries in the world today. Prospects for a brighter, more prosperous future appeared dim. But, and I suspect many of you know where this story is going, USAID and other development partners stepped in to help the Republic of Korea and the South Korean people to rebuild their country. We brought our ingenuity. We offered our resources and our expertise from within the private and public sectors alike. USAID's partnership supported the people of South Korea as they built their country's agricultural sector, their health system, their educational institutions, and their major industries, all engines that drove development. And we supported South Korea as it integrated with the global economy, which grew its economy dramatically. Our development work in South Korea was laser focused on alleviating suffering, supporting sustainable and market-based solutions, and sharing democratic ideals, all building a foundation for the country's long-term growth, security, and resilience. And the development that took other nations decades to achieve was accomplished by South Korea in a very, very short time. The Republic of Korea's destiny changed, democracy delivered, and naturally the rest of the world noticed. I tell this story to illustrate the success of how a genuine development partnership, in this case with the Republic of Korea, can be central to developing and advancing both U.S. foreign policy and the priorities of our partners. USAID development practices elevate inclusion, transparency, good governance, robust civil society, a free press, and respect for human rights and democratic norms. We do so not simply because these are moral goods, although they are, but also because they are key enablers to sustainable growth. They are our secret sauce for assuring that projects provide a return on investment and do so for those most in need and in a sustainable fashion over time. And they built on a decades-long history of supporting partners to achieve their own priorities and their self-determination. And our results demonstrate our success. 11 of our top 15 trading partners today, like the Republic of Korea, were once aid recipients from the United States. We build strong societies. We work with partners on their own paths to success. This is our story, and we are very, very proud of it. We are proud that USAID assistance does not need to be repaid. They are not loans. We are proud that USAID seeks to offer emerging economies of the future a new development model, one rooted not in debt and dependence, but in mutually beneficial economic integration, inclusivity, locally led solutions, and democratic values that can help transform our shared planet for the better. We do not seek to weaponize development assistance for our own benefit or to leverage it for our own goals, as the PRC often appears to do. Rather, we pursue development diplomacy to provide public goods and to strengthen the global commons. The question then becomes not if the PRC, the US, or anyone else will win the Global South, but how we can support the Global South itself to be a winner, driving its own destiny. Such an outcome, we believe, will contribute to a world consonant with US interests and values. This complements our longstanding practice that emphasizes environmental impact, social impact, and financial sustainability. Still, we recognize that what Beijing does abroad can have a detrimental impact on our national security interests and those of our partners, and can undermine our affirmative development agenda. And while we may have a limited ability to change the decisions made by the PRC and those decisions that are made in Beijing on any given day, we can work with our allies and partners to shape the environment in which Beijing operates. USAID can help set the table for the world in which we want to live. We will work with the private sector to unleash economic growth and our partners' potential. And we know that our grants-based assistance can go even further when it is put together with US public and private investments, which far outstrip the resources that the PRC has brought to the table to date. We can do all that, elevating our contributions, doubling down on our commitments, and appealing to the best parts of our rooted history around the globe. That is how we will show our value, and that is how we will continue America's development leadership into the future. And we will do so along with our like-minded allies and partners, as well as through international coordinating mechanisms to extend resources and technical expertise, ensuring that our work is complementary, respects existing regional architecture, and, importantly, is led and guided by local communities. For developing countries to flourish, each nation should be able to choose their own path forward, including how they manage their resources and with whom they partner. Across the globe, USAID seeks to show countries the possibilities of a cooperative, inclusive, and, to use Administrator Power's phrase, a big-hearted development model, a model rooted in cooperation, in economic trade and integration, and in connectivity, not debt traps or never-ending foreign assistance dependence. We offer our partners a development model that celebrates listening to and learning from them, understanding their concerns, and finding a pathway forward together. In so doing, we firmly are of the belief that together we will be able to build free, open, and inclusive architecture for the balance of the 21st century and a more sustainable, prosperous, and secure globe for all. With that, let me again extend my heartfelt gratitude to the Atlantic Council for generously providing me the opportunity to share these thoughts with you this morning. And let me now yield to this morning's panel for further discussion. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for those remarks, which really set us up perfectly for the discussion that we're going to have today. And next, it's my privilege to introduce our moderator for that discussion, Niva Yao, who is a non-resident fellow with the Global China Hub at the Atlantic Council. Niva's research focuses on China-Central Asia relations, China's new overseas security management infrastructure, and the BRI and the politics of foreign infrastructure and investment, among many other topics. Between 2018 and 2023, Niva was based at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Academy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. Niva, I'm so glad you could moderate today. Take it away.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you everybody for joining and listening into this panel. And thank you so much, Michael, for offering your thoughts on the BI and the way that international development aid has evolved during this time. So in this panel, I would like to kick it off with Victoria Chongqi, who is a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Latin America Center. And she's also a postdoctoral scholar and teaching fellow at the University of Southern California. Victoria, I want to first question for you is what do you see have been the main developments of the Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America, and how would you assess the past 10 years?
Thank you, Niva, very much for having me, and also the Atlantic Council for the invitation and for having this discussion, especially recently after the most, I guess, meeting that the BRI had. So in terms of Latin America, I think that I wanted to emphasize two things, right? The first one is that we should be really mindful on not overestimating or overemphasizing the effect or China's influence in general in the region, especially when it comes to the BRI. I say this because if we think about the last 10 years, right? I mean, Latin America, the region, did not participate or was officially invited into the initiative until 2018. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in the bigger scheme of things, when we're thinking about the different projects, I think that one of the many comments that experts in the region have had, and even the politicians, right, is that what is different about the BRI and the projects that were already taking place, or the different infrastructure, I guess, initiatives, right, in many ways that have been taking place in the region with China. And if we are thinking about in terms of amount of quantity, in the larger scheme, China only represents about 6% of the region's investment, whereas the European Union and the United States compose at least 70 to 80% of those investments. So that's the first thing that I wanted to emphasize, right? In terms of yes, let's not overemphasize or overestimate that impact. At the same time, I think that we also should not underestimate it. Why do I say that? It's because China has entered the region primarily in economic terms since the early 2000s, right? And it has evolved its relationship from building its commercial exchanges into a more investment oriented and whatnot. And in the last 10 years or so, of course, infrastructure. And in this case, rather than focusing on volume, I think that what we have been seeing, especially in the last 5 years, has been more on very specific projects, very key projects, and that a lot of them go hand in hand with the very, I guess, national interest of the very Chinese state, right? Which is sustainable development, green technology, and whatnot. And I say that because I think that in comparison to other partners, and by that I mean the United States or the European Union, what we have seen evolving in the region is that China is definitely entering more energy projects or energy-oriented projects, more strategic projects. In this case, I think that we have been hearing a lot of it in the last probably 2 or 3 years, which is lithium, right? So in that sense, I think that on the one hand, let's not exaggerate what China has done or could have done in the region. On the other hand, let's also not underestimate it. And I say that very briefly and to open up space for questions, because I'm sure that here Mr. Schulman has much more to say, especially in his report. But he's very right in emphasizing that China is not necessarily winning. And I think that Mr. Schiffer, he has emphasized it's not about winning the Global South, but rather what kind of partner it can be. And rather than think of it as a partner that is coming to take over the region, is more a partner that has become complementary in many ways, actually, to the region. So I think that that's the main takeaway if we want to think about the BRI in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. And this is a very fascinating topic if we were to look into the strategic resources that China is looking for in various regions. And, we are very happy to also have with us Sanusha Naidu, who is a senior research associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. And she primarily works on South-South cooperation and the footprints of emerging powers like China in Africa. Sanusha, I would like to ask you to have a brief reflection of Africa's experience with the BRI in comparison with what Victoria have told us just now, because Victoria said that the BRI only really entered Latin America in 2018, and obviously we know that China has built more presence in Africa even before the BRI. So perhaps what have been some of the long-standing effects that are similar to the BRI in the past decades, and please share us your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Niva, and let me also extend my gratitude to the Atlantic Council for inviting me and for convening a very timely discussion on the BRI. I think I want to start off and say that much of what Victoria has said has parallels in the African context, particularly in terms of the kind of footprint China has within the African context. And you're quite right, Niva, to suggest that it predates the BRI's actual implementation or incubation or announcement of the BRI in 2013. Because in the case of Africa, the Chinese presence actually extends back to 2001, particularly when the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation was initiated and put into implementation in terms of where it was. And of course, it started off at a very, very small level of trade. And it was around about $10 billion US at the time. But I think this is where it's very interesting in terms of the comparison with Latin America, because the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation has been the key instrumental driver, the key framework that actually defines how China actually looks at its presence in Africa through the investment, but through trade, and most importantly, I think through the kind of infrastructure projects that they have been financing. But I think what we also have to be very mindful of is that when you look at the FOCAC program, and especially in 2006, which in many respects was a pivotal year for when the FOCAC became quite elevated at the heads of state level, where you had a very key unveiling of projects, but also investment vehicles, the China Africa Development Fund, the kind of facilities that promote Chinese companies and SOEs in the infrastructure space. And of course, this was key to how much of investment was coming into the continent based on the development financing that was coming in. And so you saw a kind of, the heydays, if I can say it in that way, around 2006, and then moving to 2012. And then, of course, you begin to see not necessarily a dramatic shift, but you actually see a kind of reduction in the emphasis of how much of investment and development financing comes into the continent under the FOCAC label. And I think it kind of coincides with the launch of President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. And the Belt and Road Initiative, it's not very clear in terms of what Victoria was saying is, what are the projects that are specifically and uniquely linked to the Belt and Road project initiative, and what are projects that are specifically and uniquely FOCAC. Now, this is where I think it becomes interesting. If we go back and look at the last forum, the last FOCAC summit that was hosted, you're immediately seeing a reduction in investment. So from 60 billion to 55 to 50, some are even arguing that is now changing the kind of relationship the Chinese state, or the kind of investment that's coming through the policy banks. And I think this is where Michael's paper becomes very relevant for us in the African context, is what's going on in China with the lending and the concessional finance that's coming through the FOCAC. But what's also increasingly interesting is the role of the private sector, and how much of the defraying of cost and the underwriting of investment, and especially investment and development finance in Africa, is now being shifted to the private sector. The question here for me, and my institute has just done a very kind of snap survey, perception elite survey on the BRI in South Africa, and I can talk about this later. The perception is, from the first kind of understanding of FOCAC, is where was the monitoring and evaluation? Because the assumption is being made that a lot of the projects, in my opinion, and this is a perception again that we need to test, is projects that have been carried over. They're not completed. They're kind of not finding the 3-year program, because the FOCAC is a 3-year program. Every 3 years you host FOCAC, and next year the FOCAC is going to be hosted again. So what's happening here is, we find that there may be projects on the books that are not completed, that are basically finding a kind of hangover effect and carrying on to be put onto the books going forward. And more importantly, I think now with BRI, it's even more indistinguishable to see to what extent we are actually creating a kind of understanding of the separation of BRI projects linked to now what the third forum spoke about, in terms of what President Xi Jinping speaks about around the green financing, the technological, the AI, which was quite a key issue, which kind of dovetails with some of the thinking in Africa around financing, around climate change and so forth. But what's not happening is a kind of unpacking and disaggregation of whether the BRI projects are actually being repackaged, or the FOCAC rather, projects are being repackaged as BRI projects. Just a small example, and I'll stop here, is in South Africa, we actually asked some of our colleagues within the space of working within the China-South Africa engagement, or the South Africa-China engagement, can you tell us what are Belt and Road Initiative projects and how are they separated from FOCAC projects? It was very difficult to distinguish, very difficult to identify. So I think that's a key challenge for us in Africa. But increasingly, I think we're going to see the FOCAC projects, in my opinion, become more and more falling under the banner of BRI, particularly now where President Xi Jinping has also said, we don't want to give loans as much as before. And that kind of talks to the development architecture and financing in China around the policy banks, because the policy banks in lending to Africa has also shifted and reduced their lending. So I think this is where we're going to see more and more of the project financing shifting as well. And there have been serious debates about China's relationship with certain African countries. I think the point that Victoria makes about the lithium projects that they are seeing being unveiled in Argentina, and of course now in Chile with the kind of engagement with at the BRI, at the forum, the third BRI forum, I think also talks to the complexities of some of the tensions in the DRC. So the critical minerals engagement, I think, is being re-looked at in certain ways. And I think we're going to try and understand this now in the sense of when we look at FOCAC next year, we're going to start to have to ask ourselves, as some of the colleagues in Africa, experts have been talking about, is do we in Africa understand the distinction between the two?
Thank you so much, Sanusha, especially for bringing up the latest developments from the forum, which we are going to get to that in just a second. We are going to have in the panel Michael Schulman, Michael, congratulations for the report that you wrote on why China won't win the Global South. Michael is a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. He has more than 25 years of experience in Asia and is currently a contributing writer to The Atlantic, and previously was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and Time Magazine. Michael, thank you so much for the report and for joining us to discuss your views on the BRI, especially the latest. To start off with, I would like to ask you, how would you assess the relations between China and the Global South as China grew more powerful in the past 2 decades? And what are perhaps briefly some of the new insights, the new agreements and deliverables that have come out of the forum, the Belt and Road Forum just this month, and how would you see this change the dynamic between China and the Global South in the next decade? Thank you. Michael, you're muted. Please unmute yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction. I think the Belt and Road Forum last week shows a lot about how the relationship between China and the rest of the Global South has changed over the decade of the BRI and a little bit before. You know, the Chinese like to portray themselves as kind of fellow travelers with the developing world, that they experienced similar trials and difficulties in development and experiences with the West. And as China's grown much wealthier, much more powerful, that's becoming less true. The relationship between China and the rest of the Global South is taking on something of a superior and subordinate balance between them. You know, when you look at the Chinese economy, it's almost as big as the entire rest of the developing world all combined. China is a major trading partner for many countries in the Global South, as well as a major creditor, the BRI being one reason for that. And therefore, China has tremendous economic leverage over the rest of the Global South and influence. And this is creating, I think, some tensions between China and other members of the developing world. You see that, for example, in the controversies over debt restructurings for troubled low-income countries. You see it in some calls from developing countries that China needs to take more responsibility for the effect of climate change, the effect it's had on climate change, for instance. But when you look at the forum, the Belt and Road Forum last week, you know, it shows us the form that this change is taking. This was really a China event. This was China in charge, where other countries in the developing world were all expected to to send delegations and to China, more or less to praise Xi Jinping, to tell the Chinese what a great job they've done and thank you for all your generosity. And China, I think, when you look at where Xi Jinping's foreign policy is going and the way it's developing, my sense is that this is the kind of relationship that Xi would like to see with the Global South going forward. That China doesn't necessarily want, partners per se, that China would prefer clients or some form of that. Xi Jinping seems that he wants to build a block of support within the developing world that he can lead and support that, where countries would support China's own international agenda and its own national interests, and which is increasingly to rewrite the rules of the global order and to gain more and more power vis-a-vis the Western countries, especially the United States. So I think the way that the BRI has developed in the last 10 years is kind of symbolic of the direction that China's relationship with the global South has taken overall, and also increasingly where China, I think, wants to see it going.
Thank you, Michael. I just want to highlight some of the topics that we mentioned just now, particularly, on, your last note on regional perception. I think that was something that was, brought up multiple times, obviously, because when we are looking at, Latin America, we saw that the delegations that actually went to China last week were very different, and same with Africa too. There are many leaders that used to go in the past, few forums, and they're no longer attending. And I think that, really reflects what Michael, was trying to get at, that, countries now see that, as China is more powerful, it is no longer equal partners as it was before. And it would be very difficult for China to present itself as an equal partner. So I just want to ask all of you to make a comment about that in the regions that you work in. There's obviously no united front from any region in their policy on China. So when it comes to the BRI moving forward, looking at the countries in your region that are, very much on board versus the countries who are maybe a little bit skeptical, how could this change the dynamics within Global South, between Global South countries? What are some of your thoughts on that? Who would like to go first? Victoria, perhaps?
Yeah, I was going to say I could probably go first. I think in terms of who attended, right, it's very representative as well, like I mentioned earlier, of who decides to sign it and what difference does it make. I think that Sanusha here made a really good point, and I want to reemphasize it, right, in that in many cases there are already strategies that have been happening or that have been shared and with China. So for each individual countries, the big question is what added value, if you will, right? Or what other benefits will it bring into being part of the BRI? And I think that's something to keep in mind, is that the fact that you sign a memorandum of understanding with China in terms of the BRI doesn't necessarily mean that a project will take place or that a project is taking place. So I think that on the strategic Chinese side, you have credibility, right? It brings credibility to the initiative itself. Now, when it comes to practice, again, the bigger question is, how is this different from what has been existed? Now, that doesn't undermine, of course, the fact that for countries that have signed in, some of the, particularly when it comes to financing, is facilitated, so it becomes easier. So I think that in the region, at least in my region, in Latin America, something that we have seen is that there has been a enthusiasm for many of the countries that have signed on, right? And what they were waiting for was, okay, what else is going to bring? But over time, what we have seen is that, yes, there is perhaps more companies coming in and seeing in the terms of more companies coming into a very specific, what's the name, industry, sorry, it's very early over here, right? But another question is, are these companies coming in because of the BRI only, or because it was already part of the Chinese strategies, again, in the region, right? Extracting certain resources or seeking for certain resources. And like I said, in the last couple of years, lithium. So I think that has become a trend, again, in that there was over enthusiasm. And this is why I emphasize, let's not overestimated, but at the same time, right, the underestimation it's also something to take into consideration, because I think that for the countries, at least in Latin America, that have taken some of the or have decided to partner with China for certain large infrastructure projects, whether they're BRI or not, particularly for those countries that have a higher risk, weak institutions and whatnot. I think that working with some of the Chinese companies have actually highlighted some of those risks, if that makes sense. So a lot of it comes not only working with the Chinese, but also how governments decide to work with the Chinese companies. I think that it's very key to emphasize, at least in Latin America. I cannot speak for other regions, so I'd be curious to actually hear what my colleagues here have to say about that. So I hope that answers your question in one way or another.
If I may, so I think there's a lot here that we can pick up in terms of regional dynamics. And I think Africa is a very heterogeneity in terms of regional spaces. So you've got the Southern African region, and then you've got East Africa, then you've got West Africa, and of course, very often the North African belt of countries up in the north don't necessarily fall within the state. They kind of, I think in that context, there's more that needs to be understood in terms of how the North African region actually engages with China. And there's very key interests that China has from an industrial perspective, from an economic perspective there, particularly with Morocco, for example, building kind of electric vehicle car parts and manufacturing parts, partnering with countries like Saudi Arabia. And that was very key to tapping into the Southern European market and moving into over the Mediterranean and the export-based corridors, etc. Similarly, I think with China now bringing in Egypt and Ethiopia, and of course the potential for other African countries to join the BRICS, I think it also plays a role in how it galvanizes China's identity and credibility with the BRI. At the forum, we saw Prime Minister Abiy from Ethiopia, very key, very front and center in terms of presence. Walking in with President Xi Jinping and so forth. I think these are dynamics that also play to how Ethiopia, for example, will see China in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, but it has a long-standing relationship from an infrastructure development. I think when you go to Ethiopia and you look at the kind of development that Ethiopia has taken forward in terms of its infrastructure and transport infrastructure domestically in Addis Ababa, you kind of see a replication of some of China's infrastructure and transport, etc. So Ethiopia is an interesting country in that respect. What I'm trying to get at is, despite regional dynamics, it's also about countries within regions who have developed particularly strategic dynamics with China. So if I look at Southern Africa, I think South Africa's relationship with China, and I really love the point Victoria made, signing an MOU is only as good in terms of what you want to do with the MOU and how do you operationalize this MOU. And I think in the South African context, it's a dilemma in terms of how do you operationalize the projects you want, because South Africa is a key transport and logistics hub for the region. And it wants to tie in and feed into that transport and logistics hub in terms of the South African region, whether it is the critical minerals extractive or whether it's the goods and services, movement of goods and services, etc. But it also cannot do that if China has a much more different relationship or a strategic relationship with Namibia or with Botswana or with Angola. So it becomes quite difficult in terms of what kind of BRI project that South Africa wants to have and how that ties in with the kind of regional dynamic in terms of the trade corridors, the economic corridors, which South Africa wants to build up. And I think on the port infrastructure, which is critical as well in terms of how China is now looking at port infrastructure to secure their economic interests in Africa, they're actually investing in ports where they may feel that they have to build up these ports in terms of access, in terms of stability, because South Africa also has a serious dilemma and serious infrastructure deficits when it comes to the port access and of course linked back to domestic issues around electricity, electricity output, infrastructure linked to the state-owned enterprise Transnet, and the capacity issues in the Durban port on the East Coast. So looking at the corridors as well, if China starts moving up the East Coast of Africa and starts building up those corridors in terms of how it links that back to the kind of vision it has, not just for FOCAC, but I think the broader BRI and the broader global development initiative, which Michael spoke about as well in the paper, I think is critical in trying to find how these are becoming interconnected in the context of how China sees its relationship. I think for other countries like Rwanda, it's very critical that, building deep ties with China, but also maintaining ties with Europe is critical for Rwanda. So I think the competitiveness of regions are going to be based as well on what individual countries are seeing as trying to attract the investment to China. So it kind of creates an elasticity in terms of how this goes forward.
Michael, you need to unmute yourself again. I'm sorry.
Okay. I don't know why I keep getting, okay. If I can jump in on that for a second. I think looking at it from a broader perspective, when you look at international surveys of views of China and other countries, there's a few things become pretty apparent. One is that there's an obvious divide in views of China between, let's say, the West and the rest, or the West and its partners, and much of the developing world, where the countries associated with the West tend to have very, very, very unfavorable views of China. Much of the global South tends to have significantly more positive views, and that's a sign that some of China's engagement through BRI and other initiatives has actually paid off in terms of China's image and influence. At the same time, you also see that this influence that China has is a little bit shallow. I think there's some very interesting data from Afrobarometer showing that even people in Africa who have very positive views of China also have extremely positive views of democracy, for instance. So their views of China aren't necessarily influencing some of their other views about the society side around them and the kind of countries that they want to live in. I think you'll also find there's some interesting survey data coming out of a group called Aid Data in the United States that shows that leaders in the developing world, though they acknowledge China's growing role in development and importance in the global economy, they also note that China isn't as helpful as a development partner as the United States and many other players, such as multilateral organizations like the World Bank. So you start to see a very mixed picture of the way that China's outreach to the global South has influenced kind of the way China is viewed and its programs are viewed. But also, I think beyond that, I think what we need to say, and this has already been touched upon by the previous speakers, that the whole idea that there is a quote global South unquote is a bit of a leap, right? You're talking about a tremendously diverse region with tremendously diverse countries that have very diverse interests, and they all have different relationships with China as well as different relationships with the United States and Europe. And what you're seeing happen within the global South as well is that there's different centers of power emerging in each region, and some of these emerging powers are also looking beyond. We look at, for example, India and Brazil, for most notably, are looking to raise their voices on the global stage. So, in a certain sense, the global South is also creating competitors to China, as well as potential partners or clients of China. So it's a very, very mixed picture of what's going on right now in China's relations with the developing world.
Thank you for that. Before we go into Q&A, I'm just going to exploit my powers and ask one more questions out of the discussion that we had just now. So many things about perception and image of China, and from what I've heard so far in this past hour is a lot of this perception and image of China is grounded in economic projects, the supposed economic contributions, the figures, the billions of dollars that, China's been able to pour into, certain countries in different regions. Now, how is this perception of China is going to change now that we know China is no longer able to commit in terms of investments in the same amount of volume as before, and also changing the destination of these investments into new sectors? Do you think that this will actually help China build its influence in the region that you work in, or do you think that this actually will weaken China's ability to compete with other regional actors now that many regional actors are positioning themselves to offer alternatives? What does each of you think? Maybe we'll start with Victoria again, if that's okay.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for asking that question. And actually, I think that Michael here and even Sanusha, right, highlighted something very important, is that the fact that China has entered as a competitor has actually increased the competition, right? Because we're talking about regions, or rather countries. And I think that that's another thing very important to emphasize, that the fact that we talk about Latin America or Africa or Asia, right? They are heterogeneous countries. And indeed, the relationship that each of these countries have with China also defines, right, how they will relate with it, or rather, I would say, Chinese companies, and also the kind of exchanges that they can get. So that aside, I think that competition has increased, and it's good, especially for regions that in many cases, at least particularly in my Latin America, a lot of the conversation was, right, we are taking China, not necessarily because we are forced to, but rather we don't have another option. So that has really provided, right, rather more alternatives. So this is what I was saying earlier, that when we compare, for example, the type of financing that China has had, yes, there has been some debt distress, but then again, a lot of these countries precisely went to China because they were already in debt distress. One of the countries that I can think of is, for instance, like Ecuador, right, which they had actually had to refinance in the last couple of years. The case of Venezuela, in which actually China had to make the decision saying, how can we get out of this, right? Because we did not, I guess, properly made a corresponding risk assessments to be able to see where this relationship was going. So in that sense, I think that it has created more opportunities. And one of the, I guess, more tangible examples that I can give you is, for instance, the implementation of 5G. Right now, Chinese companies, in this case, Huawei, right, is the main distributor of 5G technology infrastructure in the region. Perhaps in some cases, because it was willing to go into areas that other companies couldn't have gone, or it's not just about the capacity, right, or the economic I guess ability that China has, but at the same time is, and I remember this phrase, I think it was David Lambton in one of the previous conferences that I had with him, where he said, what Chinese companies have done in many ways is not necessarily going in there and presenting the projects, but rather it's going in there and responding to some of the needs that some of these countries did not necessarily have. So I think that those are some things that we need to take into consideration. And again, highlighting what Sanusha and also Michael have said earlier, is that it's not just what China is offering, but again, how these different countries are taking China's offer and how they run with it, right? So it's not who is in the game to play it, but also what resources are available, what resources can be gained, and how they work through this entire negotiation process and execution process at the same time. And that's when risk assessment comes about. That's when transparency comes about. And to be very bluntly, right, China has not been great at it in many ways, or at least for many of the projects. So here's where, for example, other partners have been useful, such as those from the United States, the European Union, and what have you. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good point that Victoria makes on access, because access is very important. And we see similar trends, I think, in Africa around the access to telecommunication, or the access to not just being able to have access to investment in telecommunication, but the fact that now we're seeing Huawei handsets being used, being sold at a cheaper price. I mean, this is something I think that creates competition in the market as well, because the kind of range of products you have at the in terms of telecommunication products that are on offer, Samsung, LG, you have now the biggest kind of smartphone in Africa that is affordable but gives you access in terms of a smartphone is, I think, Transsion, which is a Chinese brand. So I think these are all very important things that come in terms of what is the responsive strategy of China in terms of what it is that is on offer in terms of not just access to the kind of market, but access to the fact that it opens up the space for ordinary citizens to have access to products that they would not normally have access to. It makes it cheaper. And we did this brand exercise in South Africa where, for example, Hisense, which is started off in the 80s and now is a major luxury brand offer in terms of refrigerations and so forth, air conditioning, etc., is a key player in the market. Similarly with Sinotech and so forth. And I think in the US it's TLC. So very often what's very interesting about the Chinese presence is how do you actually disaggregate the footprint of Chinese companies and Chinese state investment. So you got the high level projects that are built in terms of infrastructure development, which is more kind of the macroeconomic issues, but it's also the kind of coming into the market, for example, with access to motor industry. For example, one of the increasingly interesting brands in South Africa is Haval. Haval has now come into the market at an entry level. It's the cheapest kind of SUV you can buy, and people are flocking to buy it. Where previously there was a sense of hesitancy because you weren't sure of the quality of the brand. People would not go and buy a Chinese-made car or a Chinese-made vehicle. Now they're flocking to buy it because it's offering cheaper access in terms of financing. What kind of financing, motor financing, that they're coming up with as well. So those are the issues I think become interesting in the market. But I want to also pick up on a point that Michael referenced to, and that is competing centers of power within the Global South. For example, one of the key issues for me is India and Africa. I think India and Africa is a critical dimension because the India-Africa relationship has to be out, considering what India has done at the G20 in saying that the African Union has to become the 21st permanent member of the G20. Now, that's critical for Africa in terms of how the development agenda is looked at, how it opens up the space for Africa to have voice and agency in a multilateral organization that's dealing with the reformation of the international system around financial instruments, but also in terms of the kind of financial architecture we're seeing in terms of equity and liquidity. And that raises questions for why China didn't think about this, why China didn't propose, or even South Africa being the only African member in the G20. So these kinds of levels of competition become interesting. But China has also become quite cognizant of the fact that some of the things that I think that they've been funding in terms of projects haven't been reaching their kind of a strategic fulfillment from the Chinese side, from an objective side. They've kind of went on. And one of the ones that come to mind is the Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya. Because I think the Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya had been a very critical one in terms of the connectivity, the railway that will connect to Mombasa and also to Uganda and so forth. But the Chinese also became hesitant because it became overpriced for them, overpriced for a number of reasons. And I think it raised the question of the debt issue. It raised the question of, did you actually understand the terrain in Africa? And these are key questions that need to do. So I think where China is going to be interesting is looking at those competitors from the Global South that start to actually see the African market, see the African landscape, and realize that they have critical engagement with, say, the Gulf states in the east coast of Africa, Turkey is in Africa. India is going to look at the pharmaceuticals, look at the private sector and how their private sector is going to move forward. These are going to be key pulse points for China to start thinking about.
Michael, again, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I don't know why I keep getting muted. Where is it? You got it? Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know why my system keeps muting me. I think, looking at it on kind of a wider scale, I think what you find is, look, the Belt and Road in many ways was kind of like a stroke of genius. I mean, think about it. It's China wanted to expand its economic and financial and political influence around the world. It tapped into what was an obvious need through large sections of the emerging world, that a need for more development finance, a need for more infrastructure. These needs were not being met by the existing institutions, and it was a great recipe, a great way to expand Chinese power. The question is, what happens now if the money runs out? And if there's data showing that Chinese development lending has fallen off dramatically in the last several years, and there's some thinking that it's not going to recover. It wasn't just a function of the pandemic, for instance, that it may recover a little bit, but not back to the levels where it was before. And I think some of that is actually wise, because as we know, a lot of the money that got thrown around wasn't particularly used very well. You have debt issues in developing countries, and the Belt and Road has contributed to them. There's been question about the economic viability of many of the projects. So kind of a strategic reboot on the BRI is probably a really good idea. On the other hand, you also have to ask, well, how are members of the Global South going to now relate to China if basically the money stops flowing? There's this, nobody wants you when you're down and out, right? So if you can't spend the money anymore, what kind of relationship do you have with these members of the Global South? And can that relationship and that influence then survive a situation where China is not providing the goods in the way that they used to be, so to speak? And that's where you get into the issue of what's going on with the Chinese economy more broadly. The economy is really in not very good shape right now, and the outlook, the economy probably won't stay as bad as it is now indefinitely, but the outlook isn't nearly as bright as a lot of economists had expected. There are serious structural problems that are not being dealt with. So you're also looking at a situation where China is facing greater competition within the Global South, both from the West and as India and other players in the Global South, at a moment when China economically is not in the same position that it had been to back up its global agenda financially.
Thank you so much. And so we have last couple of minutes for the Q&A section. So for anybody who would like to ask the questions, please send the questions to us. I already have 2 questions in front of me that I'm going to combine them together with some of the reflections, some of the key points that was brought up. So I've been hearing a lot about competition, and I want to ask Victoria and Sanusha particularly, if you have any examples in mind where other institutions such as Western governments or Western institutions such as the World Bank, are there examples where these institutions are offering more than China? And if so, what are those areas that other institutions are better at doing in your region than China? I'm particularly looking for projects, perhaps economic projects or non-building or reforms. In your opinion, what are some things that other governments are doing better than China? And if you think that this is something that China could start to address.
I can start actually. So I think that something that has been characteristic in the region, and there have been a few reports on it. I think that even Michael in his report emphasized, right? For instance, when it comes to financing and helping actually many of these countries who have gotten in trouble just because of finance restructuring and whatnot. China has played a big role, and when I say that in the sense of the Chinese Development Bank, the China Exim Bank, they have provided, in fact, in the last 10 or so years, more financing, right, than the World Bank and the IMF combined. What is very interesting, though, is that, for instance, in the case of Ecuador, where it ran into debt crisis, right, they actually went back to the World Bank to look for help. So I think that here is where it is important to say that, on the one hand, China has been acting as a competitor, right, in offering options and alternatives. On the other hand, when it runs into trouble, or when it doesn't know what else to do, countries have actually gone back, right, to a lot of the Western-led institutions. And I think that here is something that, in many ways, Chinese companies, Chinese firms, or Chinese institutions still lack, which is accountability and transparency. And I say that, for instance, because a lot of the Chinese financing institutions, they don't public, for example, disaggregated data or disaggregated information on how they are lending into countries, or what kind of loans they are. And if those are published, there are a lot of non-disclosure clauses, right? And they would say, for instance, that here's where countries, or it depends on the host countries. So in many ways, on the one hand, you could put weight in saying that there needs to be more transparency. And in fact, this is actually what came out in the BRI forum for at least many of the countries, right, that were attended and were part of it, is that we welcome Chinese companies coming in. We welcome the Chinese state coming in into projects and be participants and what have you. However, right, what we would like to see more is transparency, accountability, and an enforcement of many of policies that can perhaps worsen some domestic situations. So in this case, right, again, in the case of Ecuador is the most recent that I can think of, at least when it comes to the financing, where really you needed, I guess, institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF to come in. If I want to think about of other cases, not necessarily Western institutions per se, but for instance, the Humble cable, which is a fiber optics cable that, I guess, in Chile, the country was very enthusiastic to open up for public bidding and whatnot. So for the longest time, right, there was a discussion of Chinese companies coming in. However, at the end of the day, an Australian company was selected. And I think that a lot of the conversation at that time, right, aside from the fact that perhaps there were pressures, geopolitical interests of playing one side or the other, one side being, for example, the United States and the other side being China, at the end of the day came with the question of how much it was going to cost, the kind of infrastructures that we're going to build, and the kind of institutions that were in place to ensure that the project was going to run as it should have been. And yet, even with a Western institution, even with Western companies, the project, one of the main partners, for example, just fell through. So again, I guess a lot of the questions, my point is that whereas there is competition, whereas there are issues that are at place in terms of choosing between one institution and the other, rather than seeing them as competing, at least in Latin America, I think in many cases has been rather complementary. Not necessarily a replacement, but I guess ideally for at least many countries of the region, they will want to have as many players as possible and as many offers as possible. And here's where a competition plays in, right? What can you offer in the best way possible to ensure that I can get access to not only financial resources, but also technology and the training event, right, that I might need for my development processes. I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, just to say, in the context of Africa, I think it's very difficult to disaggregate right now. The Chinese development assistance, the financing, as Michael said, is scaling back quite dramatically. I think they're not funding as much as they used to before. And I think they're relying on trying to defray costs or to get partners on board, like their private sector, to come in and help to assist in the financing. When it comes to the IMF and the World Bank, I think the case of climate financing is very critical in terms of the just energy transition, because the just energy transition part from the World Bank around our climate change policy and climate transition energy policy still sees the IMF, the world, and the World Bank still sees the developed world putting money into that. Of course, now we're not sure in terms of the geopolitics of all of this and how it will play out. But I think for China, to circle back to a point that that Michael made about the how does when the money dries out, what happens? I think in the case of China, one of the things that I feel that they are trying to reboot on is trying to bring partners into their financing space or financing spectrum. And bringing Saudi Arabia, for example, is a critical actor. I would say look at the number of countries that have been or are currently being or have joined the new development bank, the BRICS the pseudo BRICS development bank, but the new development bank. If you look at the UAE is got flush money, and it wants to start using that money to try and put some kind of investment into the bank. But in terms of putting it into the bank, it also means that the kind of shareholder content of shareholding of the bank will need to take into account if new money comes in, because the 5 core members of the BRICS remain the 55% controlling shareholders. So this again creates a kind of replication of some of the challenges that China raises as criticisms of the quota issue in terms of the voting rights and the currency question in the IMF. But looking at how China may want to use the AIIB, the Silk Road Fund, all kind of linking together its financing vehicles, kind of bringing them together in a kind of collectiveness. I think having Saudi Arabia help to bring their kind of financing into the Moroccan project around the EV market, and using China's companies are going to be ways and means that China is going to innovate on this. And I think the expansion in terms of the BRICS kind of sees this in a way where this is kind of critical. But of course, now there's a roadblock here with this whole challenge around China's Middle East policy and what's currently happening in terms of the conflict. So I think what's going to be interesting in terms of how China has to find that peace and stability in those areas in order for its economic interest to go forward. I think the African Exim Bank is also critical in terms of the kind of relationship that they want to have with the Chinese in terms of the kind of economic and financing instruments. So I kind of see that there's a thinking here that we need to be very have a pulse point on in terms of how they may be thinking to innovate on their financing crises, that if the money is drying up, how they find different avenues and instruments around this. The last point I want to make is the fact around, I think it was Argentina that also kind of used the Chinese to pay back a part of their loan to the IMF. There was an arrangement there in terms of the renminbi and so forth. The Chinese model of the Hunan model of development as well is critical. I think it's interesting in terms of the Indian Ocean Rim to look at Mauritius and the relationship Mauritius has between India on the one hand and China on the other. And more recently, the Maldives elections brought together a kind of pro-Chinese president. But these are critical spaces because in the Southeast Asian context, I think there's a very real issue around how elections, democracy, and financing issues play a critical role in terms of how different countries are dealing with China, both economically and geostrategically.
Thank you so much. We are down to our last 4 minutes. So I would like to just ask for one last remark from each of you on what we should be paying the most attention to now that we are looking at all the deliverables coming from the third Belt and Road Forum. Michael.
Point.
Sorry, you have to unmute yourself again.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I think my last point is something that I think we've all touched on a little bit in different ways, which is I think most countries in the global South don't really want to choose a side or choose a development partner. or choose a block or something like that. I think this is the way a lot of the discussion kind of unfolds. But why would countries in the global south looking for more finance, more technology, want to take advantage of these different strategic competition, and not just between the United States and China or the West and China, but also within the global south itself, to expand their opportunities in terms of development and economic exchange as much as they possibly can. And I think this is one of the challenges facing China, that I think views the global south as a pool of potential support for its own agenda. That's become a key part of its foreign policy and a key part of its global outlook. The question is as the global south becomes more and more diverse and there's more and more competition, is that really even going to be possible?
Victoria Psanusha?
Let me go this time. I think for me, the big challenge or the big question is Africa is very diverse, and the heterogeneity of African economies. They as diverse from massive economies like Nigeria, which has its own structural issues, to very, very small economies like Lesotho. And what's going to be critical in this space is, on the one hand, African countries will have to think about what best suits their development nexus, what best suits their development needs. And I think on the horizon right now, we have the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and that's going to be key as well in terms of the development diplomacy and the financing of key economic outputs for African countries. And then if you think of China, how does that complement or whatever? Linked into all of this is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And one of the things that's key to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is that it opens up duty-free, market-free access for African countries to boost intra-Africa trade. Now, external partners, if positioning themselves in the African market around industrial parks, around value chains, or relocating production sites into Africa, will mean that they can actually send those goods internally without duty-free, market-free access. But there is, I think, and I stand corrected on this, but I think that within the ACFTA, you also have a kind of issue where, how do you deal with third parties? What is the external relationship with third parties? So I think you may see more strategic competition in Africa between the various countries from the global south and the global north. And I think it's going to end up in a very interesting way when we start seeing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement take root in that context.
Thank you, Sanusha. Victoria, do you have any last very quick remark?
Just very quickly, I think just emphasizing what Sanusha has said very quickly, that similarly in Latin America, there is heterogeneity. So it really depends on each country and how they decide to interact with China. Something I guess that Africa has better than Latin America is that, at least in our case, in terms of working together, right, there is still not a actual regional strategy on how to, I guess, work with China, right? Or how, because we have the CELAC forum. However, the ways in which it has worked, it has been very, I wouldn't say superficial, but rather it has been more symbolic rather than actually putting things in action. And another thing that is very characteristic of our region right now is that elections are upcoming and we have a lot of domestic issues. And I think that right now, at least for Latin America, that is priorities, because as countries, and that is the elephant in the room, right? There are a lot of domestic issues that need to be taken care of before each country can actually decide how to not only interact with China, but also with other key partners. And I think that will be our biggest challenge in the next couple of years. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is definitely true that both, in China's relations with the global south, there are many domestic issues that influence both sides. So thank you very much for everybody that has joined us for this discussion. And I encourage you, all of you, to continue to follow us as we monitor this issue. Thank you.